Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. This piece behind was something that I picked up on Facebook Marketplace. You can see why. It's really pretty. It's actually not an old piece. It's got no age to it at all. It's quite a modern piece and it was really dark wood. So I've given it a brighter, bolder, more colourful makeover using Terra Clay paint, and I'll show you how I did it. So here's how it started. It's a lovely piece. It's actually a modern piece, like I mentioned. It's got some really nice carved detail on the door fronts. It's actually a media cabinet, I think. So it's got a useful drawer for storage there. And it's also got a hole cut out in the back for wires, etc. So I cleaned it with Dixie Belle's White Lightning because I could smell some polish or cleaning products on the surface, which is obviously going to create an issue for paint sticking. So I gave it a good old clean with Dixie Belle's White Lightning cleaner, which I've got pre-mixed in a bottle there. I just find it easier to squirt on the surface sometimes than to mix the solution every single time I need to use it. And then I just gave it a really good scrub with a microfiber cloth, getting in all that carved detail, and then rinsed it with clean water afterwards. Now I'm going to use Terra Clay paint on this, which adheres to most surfaces really well. So I didn't want to give this a heavy sand with my Festool sander because I didn't really want to take away any of the dark varnish on the top of this piece. I just wanted to give it a really light scuff sand just to remove any like little bits that you could feel that were kind of sticking up, or any dings or anything like that. So I just used a Dixie Belle sanding sponge, which is equivalent to a 220 grit, and just gave it a rub down all over. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be using Terra Clay paint, but you can use this you can do this effect with pretty much any paint you like. It's a really simple technique. So if you have ever seen those kind of really bohemian layered looks and you think that there's way too much work involved, then I'm going to show you that there isn't. It's a really easy effect to kind of achieve. It does make it easier if you've got the right piece of furniture to begin with, and what I mean by that is if you had a really kind of modern flat looking piece, it would be harder to achieve this kind of look. This is going to be easier for me to achieve it on here because it's got carved detail and it lends itself really well to this particular style. So the colour that I'm mixing now with a little bit of water is called Cerulean Blue. And the reason I'm mixing it with a little bit of water is because Terra Clay paint is super thick. And it's almost like a sort of mousse consistency, and it's designed to keep its texture because it is really used for kind of artistic kind of finishes. By watering it down a touch, what it's going to do is obviously thin the paint ever so slightly. That doesn't usually affect coverage. As you can see, this is one coat of the Cerulean Blue with water added to it going straight over. It's covering the dark wood really well, but what it will do is just thin it out a little bit and stop it being quite so thick, because this is only going to be the base colour. So if you are going to recreate this with other chalk mineral paint, or you could do it with silk, it does lend itself better to a chalky kind of paint. You can pick your base colour, and then what you need to do is just completely cover your piece with your base colour. So in this case, Cerulean Blue, I'm using that as my base colour. I'm just using a synthetic brush because I just want to get this paint on. I don't need to create any texture with it because I've already got the carved detail that I'm going to pick out later. So you apply your base colour and then you completely let it dry. Once that's dry, you're going to pick a different colour. Now, I've picked yellow because it contrasts really nicely against the turquoise, but you can pick any colour you want. If you wanted a more subtle look without those kind of pops of colour, then you could pick a more kind of tonal colour. So if you wanted a more tonal kind of range to your piece, instead of, like I say, those opposite colours, then you can pick anything. This effect is going to give us that kind of layered look, but I'm only going to use 3 colours. And then you just need to randomly apply that colour, so that second colour, in areas where you think it might look good. So you could have used a very dark blue, and that would have given a more tonal range. I could have used a green for a little bit more subtlety. The most important thing is to apply this when it's dry. If you're using Terra Clay paint, don't add any water at this stage because it is very easily reactivated with water. So what I don't want to do is reactivate the blue underneath the yellow, causing them to mix together. If they do a little bit, not too much of a problem, but I really do want to keep the colours separate to one another. So I want to keep the blue and the yellow kind of separate. Don't worry too much about the placement of your second colour, because we're going to mainly cover it up. So if it looks like a hot mess express at this stage, don't panic too much. Once your second colour has completely dried, like I say, this is Terra Clay paint that I'm using, and it can sometimes take a little bit longer to dry, especially if you applied it thickly, like I have done the yellow, so that I've got those real kind of bright pops of colour. The next colour that I'm going to use is Lanis Lagoon. Now, I like to use a similar colour to my base colour, because I feel like it just gives a nice little bit of tonal variation. If you wanted to, you could just use 3 complete random shades. You could use purple, green and yellow. Obviously, it's going to look slightly different to mine, but I like to use, if I've used a darker base colour, I like to use a slightly different shade of that colour. So obviously I've got 2 blues, and in between is sandwiched my yellow. And then that yellow is going to add the contrast, it's going to add a little pop of colour. This colour that I'm using now, as you can see, it is very, very similar to the base colour, but it's a little bit lighter and a little bit brighter, and it's called Lanis Lagoon. It's a really vivid turquoise. You've probably seen me use it quite a lot before, because it's one of my favourite shades in the Terra Clay paint range. And what I'm doing is very, very slowly dry brushing Lanis Lagoon over the top of the other colours. So what I mean by dry brushing is I am taking a brush that is dry. In this case, it's a thin synthetic brush, but you can use a natural bristle brush as well. And I'm loading it up with paint, and then I'm taking the excess paint off of the bristles and just leaving enough to give me a little bit of coverage. Now, as I've said, I'm using Terra Clay paint. The coverage is amazing. I find this technique works really well with Terra Clay paint, because it is that kind of clay kind of texture that does dry brush very, very well. It layers and distresses and gives you this kind of bohemian look with very, very minimal effort. I have achieved this kind of look with chalk mineral paint from Dixie Belle as well, but I actually find this paint lends itself better to this particular look. Like I say, that's not to say that you can't achieve it with other paints, but certain paints lend themselves better to certain techniques than other ones do. I've sped this up slightly because it can be quite a slow process, because you're not just putting Lanis Lagoon or your top colour straight over the other ones and giving full coverage. You want to build it up slowly, and you want to make sure that there's still some of those other colours sort of peeking through in areas, otherwise it kind of defeats the object of putting those colours there. And it really depends on the look that you want. So if you wanted more yellow to pop through, just put less turquoise over the top of it, or put less of your top colour over the top of it. If you want a very subtle look, you can dry brush more of the turquoise over the top, and it just is about kind of playing around with those layers. This is also a good technique as well if you want to avoid distressing a piece for any various reason. You might not want to sand, and this is quite a good way of giving you that kind of distressed look with the different layers kind of poking through without having to actually sand. You just don't paint your final coat in that full coverage, which gives the impression that it has been distressed back. Now, that's not to say that if you want to wet distress or distress by sanding, you can do that. There were areas that I wanted to pull back a little bit more and reveal the dark varnish underneath. I did that with a wet distressing technique, and unfortunately my camera ran out of battery when it was filming, and I didn't realise, so I just carried on and it didn't capture too much of it. But I do cover that in other videos on my channel. I'm just showing you the top because it's not quite the same technique as the front, so I didn't really want too much of the distressing to be kind of in your face on the top. I wanted it to be more subtle. As you can see, there's very little yellow here, so all I did is just applied Lanis Lagoon apart from around the edges, and then just wet distressed it a little bit. So as you can see, I've wet distressed it a little bit, and that's just helped pick out the carved detail on the front. And then we're going to need to top coat it. So you can top coat your piece in any top coat. I'm using Terra Tough because I've used Terra Clay paint, which does require specific top coats, because some top coats will reactivate the paint, and obviously that will undo all of that dry brushing that's taken us hours to build up, and it will start to pull your paint off. So Terra Tough will not reactivate your paint, and it's comparable to Gator Hide, so it offers really decent protection and durability. When you're top coating a piece like this, I always use a brush because I just find it easier to get in all the carved detail. And as I always say, it's much better to apply very thin layers of the top coat and build it up as necessary, as opposed to trying to cover it with one thick coat and getting it all gloopy and dripping. So I only did 2 coats of this because that's all I needed, and I just worked really slowly around the carved detail until I'd got full coverage of that top coat. And then no project is complete without coloured wax. As you well know, if you've watched any of my content before, you'll know that I love coloured waxes because they can add so much depth and definition to a piece. And I'm using black on this piece because I wanted a little bit more of an extreme look. So I'm using a little bit of Best Down wax in black with a French tip brush because it's got a nice point on the end, and that's going to allow me to get into all of the carved detail. So I'm just applying it on, and I'm just making sure that the black wax is sitting in all of the recessed areas. As you can see, I've already applied the black wax on the rest of the piece, including on the carved detail and around the door edges as well. That's just going to help give me a little bit of shading, and like I say, it just adds definition and depth to your piece. And then once I had got the black wax in the areas that I wanted it, I pulled a little bit off with using a rag, and I'm actually using Easy Peasy spray wax. I usually use clear wax. This is clear, but it's just a spray version, and I just thought I'd use something different for once, and it actually worked really well. So I'm just spraying the rag as opposed to spraying the piece, because I just find that helps control where you are pulling it off a little bit better. And I'm just, all it does is just pulls off the excess black wax. So you can see it on the cloth there, how much product comes off. So it allows the black wax to rest and sit in all of the kind of further back pieces or the recessed pieces, and that's what gives you your dimension. The interior of the cabinet was in pretty good condition. There was a couple of little bits here and there, a couple of scratches and chips to the finish. So I'm using a technique that I've been using on the interior of my pieces for years, and it never fails. It never lets me down. And I'm using 2 oil-based products from Dixie Belle. One is called Big Mama's Butter, one is called No Pain Gel Stain, and I'm mixing them together to create a wax stain. I usually use a paper plate to mix mine because I just find it the easiest way, and you can see the consistency here. It very much looks like No Pain Gel Stain, but it's not as pigmented, and obviously I've mixed Big Mama's Butter into it, which is a very soft buttery wax, and it's an oil-based product. So because they're both oil-based, you can mix them both together, and then I just literally whack it on. So I'm putting it on with a brush here. As you can see, I'm applying it quite thick. This No Pain Gel Stain is actually black, and I really like using the black shade over dark wood because it really adds to the richness of that kind of rich dark chocolatey tone that's already going on there. And I do also find that it helps cover up any kind of imperfections really well. So once you've covered the area, I'm only showing you on the drawer front on this just for demonstration purposes, but I did do the entire inside and the interior of the doors as well. You just get a lint-free rag and then wipe the excess off the surface. So if you were to leave it without wiping the excess off, it wouldn't dry down particularly well. So this is something that you do need to do. It's because it's a wax product, you do need to remove the excess off the surface. So I just buffed it all with a nice lint-free rag. As you can see, it really adds to that deep kind of richness of the wood grain that's already there. And sometimes you need to buff it a couple of times just to remove any excess. But this also gets rid of any kind of light scratches and swirl marks on the surfaces as well. And here's a little close-up of the finished interior. You can just see it looks completely revived and nourished. And then a close-up of all those kind of layers, just kind of very, very subtle, but still there. And the finished stage shot, you can just see those little hints of yellow, gives you that kind of really bohemian layered look. Thank you for watching the video as always. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you've got any questions, drop them in the comments below. And I will catch you next time. Bye!